Thanks so much, Tadeusz, for this very kind introduction. Yeah, you're right. I'm working on this book project, and what I present today will be sort of an initial part of the book. But don't tell too many other people that I try to revive logical empiricism, because they might think that I'm going crazy because, you know, it's as dead as can be and so on and so forth. So it's between this group, but you're right, absolutely. What I want to do today is I want to do a little bit of meta philosophy of scientific philosophy with you. So that will be the point of my talk. And I'm really happy to be able to be part of this lovely workshop. So thanks so much for having me. Many thanks to the organizers. So I mentioned this term scientific philosophy, and Sven-Uwe already mentioned in the morning session that you don't have to go that far back in history to find a time when philosophy and science were not clearly demarcated. And in fact, the terms philosophia and scientia were used interchangeably. You could mean the same thing by them, but you all know that's no longer the case. And yet many of us still want to do scientific philosophy, and I count myself to be amongst them. So then the obvious question arises, what do we even mean by that? Right? In what sense should scientific philosophy be scientific? What is scientific philosophy? And one possible answer is just to bite the bullet and to say that we have a reasonably good understanding of what science does, right? By science in this talk, I mean mostly empirical science. So empirical science aims at the description, explanation, and prediction of natural phenomena. And then you could bite the bullet and say, scientific philosophy is just that. It's just a part of science, right? So it's in the business of describing, explaining, and predicting certain natural phenomena. Maybe it's distinguished by its special questions that you have about these natural phenomena. Maybe it's distinguished by being particularly abstract, particularly high level or the like, but yet still it's a part of science. Okay, so you could think of that as a naturalistic answer, what scientific philosophy is. We could associate it with certain names. And I think there are areas in philosophy that would fit that bill quite nicely. Okay, so for example, think of semantics. So semantics is sometimes done by philosophers of language, or philosophical logicians, but it's also sometimes done by theoretical linguists. And for many of these semanticists, you wouldn't know really, if you just looked at them working, whether they belong to the philosophical group or to the linguistic group. Okay, so it's quite interchangeably. You know, you could be in the philosophy department or a linguistics department. So there, I think this idea, this conception of scientific philosophy would work well. But then I want to claim that for other areas of philosophy, it doesn't work so well. Think of the particularly normative disciplines, like ethics or so. So I don't think that's good enough. Okay, I want to have more than that. At the end of the day, I think of the semantics example that I've just given to be more of an exception than a rule. Okay, so what we're after, I think, what we should develop jointly is a proper self-image of our discipline on which fruitful work in scientific philosophy can be based, that goes beyond philosophy as a part of science. And that is what I'm interested in today. Okay, and here is very roughly the idea. So when we do science, when we do philosophy, and, you know, basically for all the academic disciplines and beyond, we produce certain more or less rational cultural products, right? So for example, scientists would produce scientific theories, amongst others. Okay, so this is a product. And then if it's a scientific theory, I want to say that in traditional terminology, it has a direction of fit towards the world. Okay, so if you have a scientific theory and there is a mismatch between the theory and the empirical world, it's not the fault of the empirical world, it's the fault of the theory. You need to revise the theory so that it matches the world. Okay, so that's the direction of fit. So if that cultural product were mental, we would speak of the traditional mind to world fit, direction of fit. But I want to say that for rational cultural products, there's also aspects that do not need to conform to the world, but rather need to conform to ourselves, okay, to our human rationality, or to us as human reasoners. Okay, so if you take the scientific theory again, maybe for certain aspects of it, we have a choice, and the choice that we make is free. It's not dictated by the empirical world in any sense. Okay, so maybe, for example, the language, in which we want to spell out the theory is something that we can choose, and it's not dictated by a true theoretic consideration in the same way as then the claims about the world are dictated by what the world is like. Okay, so maybe there are different ways of choosing sort of conceptual framework in which we can then formulate scientific theories. And it could be the reason why we choose one framework or one language rather than another is it's just simpler for us to work in it. Okay, I'm not saying that the world makes it simpler in a sense, but it's simpler for us. Okay, so we could have kind of a pragmatic justification for choosing the one language rather than the other. But this is a justification, but it's a justification that's to do with us as human rational beings, not so much with the empirical world. Okay, so if for the moment we would think of the rational cultural product to be the world, the reality as it were, and human rationality would be the mind, then we would now speak of a world to mind fit. Okay, if there is a mismatch, we want to change our rational cultural products, the world as it were. Okay, and I want to say that scientific philosophy, in the way that I'm going to understand it in my talk, will be concerned with that left branch, whereas I think of science to be concerned with that right branch. That will be the idea. And amongst these rational cultural products, we might actually find aspects of human rationality again. Okay, so I don't want you to think of human rationality as something that's given from the start, okay, which cannot be changed, but rather it can be changed, it can be revised itself, it can be scrutinized again rationally and improved rationally. Okay, so to some extent, human rationality also turns on itself. And that's this typical thing that we have in philosophy when a philosopher looks over their own shoulder, something that I hope you will recognize as happening all the time when you do philosophy. Okay, so that's part of this conception of scientific philosophy as well. So the proposal that I want to make is I want you to understand philosophy as devoted to rational intellectual constructions, but ones that do not aim to describe nature, but that aim at realizing norms of rationality, of human rationality as such. Okay. And I want to give this a label, and the label will be rational constructionism. Okay, so don't worry, I'm not into these big isms and then write a book just about this ism or so. Okay, so that's not my style of doing things. I just need a label within this talk. And when I speak of rational constructionism, I just mean this proposal. Rational intellectual constructions that do not aim to describe nature, but that aim at realizing norms of rationality as such. That is what philosophy, scientific philosophy, is devoted to, according to that proposal. Okay, and ultimately the hope will be the proposal is not too revisionary. It will clarify our self-image if things go well, and it may actually help philosophy just a little bit in the long run, in the future. Okay, now let me stress again, I do not want to capture everything that had ever been called philosophy. That would be hopeless, as I mentioned before. Nor is my goal to police philosophers in any way. Okay, I just want to give you a hopefully useful proposal that we can work on in the future, and you might come up with other proposals. And there's no reason why philosophy shouldn't consist of many future projects simultaneously. Okay. Now, I need to explain what I have in mind here. What are these rational intellectual constructions? And that will be the first part of my talk. And then I need to explain what I mean by aiming at realizing norms of rationality as such. And that will be the second part of my talk. And then at the end of the talk, hopefully you have a good idea what my proposal really amounts to. And the final bit, that will be very short, will just draw some general conclusions and say something about the future. Okay. All right. Now, about the first part of the proposal, I want to understand philosophy as aiming at rational intellectual constructions of a certain kind, as I said. And as a start to get us going, I want to focus on special rational constructions, namely rational reconstructions. So that's a term that's already in use. I take this term rational reconstruction from Rudolf Carnap, one of the founders of logical empiricism. It was later used by other philosophers, Reichenbach, philosophers outside of logical empiricism like Habermas and so on. From some point onwards, Carnap also spoke of explication, and that's more or less the same thing. It's just that explication is restricted to concepts, while rational reconstruction is broader. You can also rationally reconstruct something that's not a concept. Okay, so that's why I prefer the older and more general term rational reconstruction. And I will explain that first and turn to construction proper, to rational construction proper afterwards. So what's the re in rational reconstruction? The idea is that you start with something that's already given, an X, okay, upon which you reflect. And that's some kind of intellectual cultural product with some sort of rationality features. So there's something about it that makes it more or less rational or more or less irrational. You need to have an entity like that. Otherwise, rational construction doesn't have a starting point. And the construction in the term, that refers to the activity of taking apart that given X, studying it, amending it, reassembling it. So this is a kind of engineering process. Okay, so we already heard in one of today's talks about conceptual engineering. Conceptual engineering is part of rational reconstruction, but rational reconstruction is broader because it extends beyond concepts. Okay, and then the final bit is the rational in rational reconstruction. And the idea is when doing that, when carrying out such rational reconstructions, you take a particular normative stance. So in my view, philosophy is predominantly a normative project. Okay. So first you determine the given X's rational or irrational features. So you study it. Then you evaluate these features. And then you do something about it. So if X is already sufficiently rational, you can leave it as it is, but you have a better understanding of its rationality. Okay. If it's overly irrational, so it's hopeless, you can just reject it. Okay, you abandon it. Or, and that's the most interesting case, you correct these irrational features and enhance the rational features by replacing X by a similar but more rational X prime. So then you exchange an X for an X prime that does better in terms of rationality. Okay, so that's the rational aspect of rational reconstruction. So you can see this sounds a bit Wittgensteinian, okay, because philosophy ends up being a kind of rational therapy, and I would agree with that. Okay, what else could I do? I'm Austrian, right? So I'm almost obliged to do that. And as Wittgenstein said, the medicine for the therapy crucially involves language. Okay, but then again, there is a lot that I find wrong in Wittgenstein. And as an Austrian, I'm allowed to say that. Okay, most of you wouldn't be allowed, but I'm allowed to say that. So the object of the therapy need not be linguistic. So it's not just about, playing around with languages, as it were. But you can rationally reconstruct lots of things, concepts and frameworks and beliefs and reasoning and decisions and norms and so on and so forth. Okay, so the object of rational reconstruction is much broader than what you would find in Wittgenstein. And the therapy need not be exhausted by diagnosis, clarification, you look at examples, you analyze, or amputation, that is, you reject, you abandon, but actually you can have treatment. Okay, so the therapy can actually involve treatment. And think of the medical case, that's the normal case normally. Okay, and I think in philosophy it's the same thing. So sometimes you have something that's not precise enough, and if necessary, you make it more precise. Okay. Sometimes it's unsystematic, you make it more systematic. Okay. And there is more. Sometimes you can give an explicit definition because that gives you better understanding. Yeah. You develop philosophical theses and theories, you construct philosophical models, you apply logical mathematical methods, and so on. All of that can be part of the therapy. Okay? Part of what's going on when you carry out a rational reconstruction. And you don't find all of these bits, especially the theory building sort of in Wittgenstein, but I think they are there and there's a good reason why they are there. Now, if you look at it, so to speak, temporally, diachronically, then typically what you have in rational reconstruction is that you have a first stage that you could call analysis. So you analyze the given X, okay? And then you do something, you destruct it or replace it by X prime. Now, in some cases, you don't have to carry out stage 2, the second step, because the analysis already reveals that, this is fine, good enough for the purposes. Okay, it's clear enough, systematic enough, consistent enough, and so on. Okay, so you just leave it as it is, and then rational reconstruction just reduces to rational analysis. Think of a traditional conceptual analysis where things go really well. That's it. But in other cases, I want to say that rational reconstruction should go beyond plain analysis. Okay, if you have an inference or the reasons for an action or the presuppositions of a question, and you find they might be, say, clear and systematic, but they are wrong, then there's something that needs to be repaired. Okay, there is a mistake made. You can't just leave it at the analysis. You need to do better. You need to go beyond analysis. Okay, that's when the stage 2, the second step, will become important. Okay, and in certain cases, it could also be that there is no stage 1, and then finally the re in reconstruction goes away. So you start, as it were, from scratch. You just build up the new X prime, okay, by similar means as in a rational reconstruction. It's just that you don't start with anything that's given. That's all. Okay, and also that can happen in philosophy, although I think it's more the exception than the rule again. Okay. If I say rational construction, I mean any of those. Yeah. If I want to say rational construction proper, I just mean this special case where you build up from scratch an X prime. Okay. But the typical case in a rational reconstruction is from X to X prime. Okay. Now, why do we clarify, precisify, systematize? Because that facilitates rational criticism and improvement. Okay, so these are intermediate steps that we need to go through to make things better. Okay, we need to get a better understanding, say, of the given X, right? Or X is not informative enough, so we need a more informative X prime. Okay, so that's why we might want to make things more precise. Okay, or X is not orderly enough; it's too unstructured, so we want to structure it. Okay, all of that will help us to increase its rationality. But the ultimate goal is rationality improvement. Okay, so X prime should be more rational than the given X, but they should be at the same time functionally similar enough for the given purposes. Okay, so for many purposes, the new X prime should be able to fill in for the old X. Okay, the rational in rational reconstruction, I want to understand you very broadly. So it's theoretically rational, practically rational. It's not just instrumental rationality. So think of everything we discuss in philosophy under this umbrella term rationality, and it's something that you could slide in here. And also this rational reconstruction or rational construction in the general case involves the study of norms, mediators for these rational constructions, and presuppositions of rationality. Okay, this study informs this kind of project and is therefore crucial for it. Okay, and the norms that come up here, the mediators and the presuppositions, they can be rationally reconstructed themselves. Okay, they can be improved themselves. So it's a never-ending process. This is again this circularity that's built into philosophy, I think. So in terms of a picture, you start with an X here, you move it into an X prime that's at least more rationally transparent, but in the general case maybe also more rational. These are human cultural products. And this is done by a mediation. So this mediator could be a theory or a definition or something like that. That's typically linguistic, and that gives you rational control over this transition from X to X prime. Okay, and you need to justify this transition. So there's also justification, of course, in philosophy. A lot of philosophy is about arguments, okay, given arguments. And the justification is in terms of similarity. So the X prime should be sufficiently similar to the X for certain purposes. Okay. So otherwise, you do not hit the target. You want to hit the target X. Okay, so that's why similarity plays a role. And then there are norms of rationality that govern the transition. Okay, norms of theoretical rationality, so they are to do with truth. In the case of philosophy, right, and that's what I'm interested in here, I will say in the second part, these are basically norms that guarantee that philosophy will not contradict, for example, empirical scientific claims or the like. Okay, because otherwise, we would be partly at least doing science again, and that's not what we want to do here. Okay, and then there will be norms concerning practical rationality. So the X prime should be more fruitful than the X, or more powerful, or simpler, or morally better, or more elegant, and the like. Okay, and all of these things can be used as an argument in favor of a rational reconstruction. So let me give you a case study now, and the case study is about truth. So what do we mean with the predicate true in the sense of true declarative sentence? Okay, and the reason I chose this little case study is twofold. First, in honor of Poland, I wanted to give a Tarskian example. Okay, so it's a Polish workshop after all. And secondly, I really think of Tarski's explication or rational reconstruction of truth as a paradigm case instance of scientific philosophy as I have it in mind here in my talk. Okay, so what is it that Tarski did in the 1930s and 1940s family? I want to say he wanted to give, and he did give, a rational reconstruction of truth. And Carnap lists it amongst his examples of explication. Okay, so this fits the historical bill as well. So Tarski, what he does is he starts by looking at examples, right, from natural language, from the history of the subject, right, Aristotle. He detects a pattern. That's all the instances of the famous truth scheme. They all seem to be assertable and acceptable. They capture this vague truth as correspondence idea. He also points to problems like liar paradox and the like. So far, this is, as it were, rational analysis. Okay, but then comes the second stage. Then he develops a way of doing better than that. Okay, and the reason is what he finds there is not good enough. So, traditional theories of truth in philosophy, they were not clear enough. What's the correspondence really? right? And there might be inconsistencies. Think of the liar paradox. So there needs to be some repairing done. Okay, and what then Tarski famously did, as you all know, is he shows you can explicitly define truth for a great variety of formal fragments of natural or scientific language in precise frameworks, such that the definition is materially adequate, but no paradoxical claims follow. And then the standard laws that you want to derive, they can be derived now. The theory is provably consistent, and it has been enormously fruitful in logic and philosophy of language and even linguistics. Okay, so that's the second part, the rational reconstruction, and the justification is like I just described. Okay, so in terms of a diagram, the X that we start here is the pre-theoretic concept, the informal concept of truth as we find it in natural language. And then after the process, you end up with the Tarskian concept of truth. That's the T prime, the X prime, as it were. Okay, the mediation is done by Tarski's explicit definition of truth in the higher order language, or in set theory, if you prefer. The similarity corresponds to material adequacy in Tarski. The theoretical rationality corresponds to formal correctness of the definition. And the practical rationality shows up in the sense that once you have the Tarskian truth concept, you have a more expressive language. The consequences are really nice, it's fruitful, it has applications, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I hope you can see it matches sort of the structure that I've delineated beforehand. Okay, so this is about the first part. Now the second part. As I said, I want to understand philosophy as devoted to rational intellectual constructions that aim at realizing norms of rationality as such. Norms of rationality as such. Okay, so this sounds pretty complicated. Okay, and it sounds quite Kantian. Okay, and that's again for two reasons. One is I'm based in Germany, and we have it in our philosophy contracts that we need to have some overlap with Kant in every talk that we give. So I've, ticked the box here. And secondly, I do think that this conception of philosophy that I'm developing here, it has a Kantian background. So the way I see Kant and the critique of pure reason is along these lines very roughly. I'm not a Kant scholar at all. Okay, don't worry. Okay, but I see this idea that he was seeing that we need to have a new project for philosophy because science has started to develop so successfully, okay? And, it's no longer the same thing. So he wanted to give an account of philosophy where philosophy studies and develops what we bring to the table as human reasoners. And that's also behind my idea, okay? So that's why I use these Kantian terms. But what I have in mind here, you can describe much more easily. So first, these rational intellectual constructions in philosophy, they aim at realizing norms of rationality as such in the sense that you want to construct an X prime that satisfies certain rationality norms. So the norms say it ought to be the case that A and X prime satisfies A, okay? Now, actually, the story is a bit more complicated because norms of rationality, they could also give you permissions rather than obligations and so on, okay? So I'm simplifying things here, but that's the idea. And secondly, the corresponding norm, and that's the as such thing, okay? They are world independent. That's the norms that are driving philosophy, I want to say, okay? So these norms do not commit oneself epistemically to particular ways nature is like, nor ontically to any particular natural universe of discourse, okay? So think of the norms that I've mentioned before. X prime ought to be clearer and more precise and more systematic and more consistent and so on than the X. None of these oughts is tied to any particular domain or universe of discourse. It doesn't come with commitments what nature is like or so on. Okay, so that's the realizing norms of rationality as such bit. Okay, that's part of the philosophical agenda. So for example, say you construct a bridge or a new glass, okay, or an artificial heart. Obviously, you invest a lot of rationality into it, but it's not a rational intellectual construction, okay, something different. So hence it wouldn't count as philosophical in my view, okay? More interestingly, if you construct a scientific concept or a theory in physics or biology for scientific purposes, then your aim normally is not to realize norms of rationality as such, but to serve specific scientific domains. Okay, you're in the business of describing, explaining, predicting phenomena in a domain. Okay, and you might have norms, right, underlying, say, the experiments that you want to make, and so on. But again, they will be tied to particular ways the world is like. They come with presuppositions about the optical measurement device that you're using, okay? And they are tied ontically to particular natural universes of discourse, because what you measure is a light beam or whatever, okay? So this construction of scientific concepts or theories, that's not a rational reconstruction in the sense that I've just described. It doesn't aim at realizing rationality norms as such. Okay, so these are not philosophical in my sense of the term. Okay, but on the other hand, if you look at these rational intellectual constructions that realize norms of rationality as such, that you find, okay, then they match pretty much what you more or less had thought about philosophy, I think, anyway. So for many of us, if you ask them what's characteristic of philosophy, you want to say, well, there's something meta about the discipline, there's something normative, there's something a priori, there's something general, it increases our self-understanding. All of these predicates would normally be attached to philosophy, and they are pretty close to that conception of philosophy that I have in mind here, okay? So for example, this a priori part that overlaps with that realizing norms of rationality as such, okay? The meta thing is because you're dealing with rational intellectual constructions. So you look over your own shoulder. You look about the rational products that you produce yourself, okay? And so on. It's a normative project, as I said before, and the like, okay? And if you go back into the history of philosophy, I want to say that my conception overlaps with bits and pieces that you find. I'm saying it doesn't coincide with everything that you find in history, but I already explained why that is, okay? But if you want to go back into the history of philosophy to give more ammunition for my project, then talk to me about it in the Q&A. Yeah. Now, what can be rationally reconstructed in that way? Okay, so that is rationally analyzed or rationally reconstructed or properly rationally constructed, maybe. I want to say pretty much everything that's to be found in modern, let's call it analytic philosophy. Okay, throughout the philosophical disciplines, amongst them truth. So that would be my Tarskian example. Okay. But, throughout the disciplines, including ethics, including metaphysics even, okay? You might say, even metaphysics, are you sure about that? Okay, I want to say yes, but I can't go into that in my talk today. But it's a special chapter, trust me, in the book that I'm writing, okay? So metaphysics has a special place in philosophy. I think that's right, yeah? And it might cause particular trouble for a proposal like mine. But I want to argue it doesn't. But if you want to hear more about it, ask me later. Okay, I can't say more about this at this point here. Now, let me compare my proposal now with science, and that hopefully will drive home my point and make it clearer how my proposal overlaps with science and in other respects how it differs from science. So as I said before, the aim of scientific theories is to describe, predict, and explain natural phenomena by means of true, informative, declarative sentences. Okay, so that's a pretty much ordinary standard conception of science. Now, rational reconstructions, in my sense, I think also occur in science. Okay, so for example, say in physics, you develop a new concept of force, okay, or a new concept of simultaneity, maybe if you're Einstein and so on. But that's always auxiliary and sort of part of the descriptive project. Okay, and it's committed to claims about the world or to particular domains. Okay, now in contrast, take my Tarskian example. Theories of truth, the aim of theories of truth is, I think, to rationally reconstruct truth, not to describe, predict, and explain natural phenomena. Yeah, since the truth predicate has a quasi-logical status, so it's a merely expressive device in a sense, its rational reconstruction is not committed to empirical claims. So a Tarskian theory of truth, you can't derive just by it empirical claims about the world. Okay, and it's not restricted to a particular domain of reasoning either, right? So you can build Tarskian theories of truth, Tarskian definitions of truth for any universe of discourse that you choose, okay? For any object language that you choose. It could be the language of chemistry, but it could be a different language, yeah? And this holds not just for Tarski, but pretty much for all the theories of truth that were developed afterwards. So there is a difference here. So how come, you might think, there are some philosophers, excellent philosophers, maybe even scientific philosophers like Tim Williamson, who liken philosophical logic very much to science. Okay. Now, formal theories of truth, at least, that's an area that belongs to philosophical logic. So people like Tim, they might always also have in mind theories of truth. So how come they think of that, theory building in theories of truth, much like empirical scientific theory building, okay, if it's not the same thing? So there's a mismatch here. How is that? And the reason is, I think, it's very easy to mistake features of rational reconstruction with features of scientific theory choice. So I want to say Tim gets it partly right and partly wrong. Okay, he gets it wrong where rational reconstruction is different from scientific theory building, and he gets it right where they overlap. So let me explain what I have in mind here. So first of all, in both cases, in the case of rational reconstruction and in the case of scientific theory building, there is something that you might call data or evidence. And what I have in mind here is rational reconstruction at least starts with an X. Okay, and in some sense, you want to stay similar to it, faithful to some extent to it. That's a bit like having evidence or data. And sometimes the X is called data or evidence. Yeah. And we all know that science requires theories to fit the evidence. So that's, that looks very similar. But if you zoom in more closely, then I think if you take your magnifying glass, you see it's not exactly the same thing. That's my point. So rational reconstructions indeed start from something. They start from some initial verdicts, and you might call them intuitions. Okay, and that's a term that I'm sure will be used in the rest of the workshop and has been used in the other talks in the morning. But here's the thing. Ultimately, rational reconstruction is allowed or even aims to correct initial irrational verdicts. Okay, and that's different from science. In science, there is no data that are irrational and hence need to be corrected. Okay, basically you collect the data. You can do that badly, sure, but that's a different point. Okay, you sometimes idealize the data. You come up with an idealized model that doesn't match the data perfectly, and you do that for simplification. Sven-Uwe mentioned that in his talk rightly. But if you do that as a scientist, you should be, first of all, clear about that, make it explicit, and always have a remaining little bit of bad conscience, because ultimately you want to explain the natural phenomenon as it is. You're not allowed to change the natural phenomena. Okay, if you want to study waves in the sea, you can correct the data a little bit if it simplifies your laws or so. That's fine. Okay, but ultimately you want to get at the real wave. Okay, whereas with rational reconstruction, you are allowed, or even you should, that's the aim, correct sort of initial verdicts that you start from. You can correct the intuitions. They're just a starting point, a feasible starting point, and that's all. Okay, so that's a very big difference, I think, and an important one. Okay. Now, secondly, scientific evidence may empirically underdetermine scientific theories. We all know that, but we still think that there is a fact of the matter out there. That's the phenomenon that makes some of these theories true and others not. Okay. Now, I want to say there is no fact of the matter that is described in the same way by rational reconstructions. Okay, but we can merely reconstruct more or less wisely. So, for example, take Tarski's theory of truth, his definition of truth. I don't know any paper on Tarski's theory of truth or the subsequent theories in this area of formal theories of truth that would defend their theories by saying, look, there is this phenomenon out there and my theory is true and yours is false. And here are, say, the empirical data or so. That's not how people argue. That's not how people argue. Okay. So I don't think there is a fact of the matter that's out there. Okay, that's the difference. Now, there are initial verdicts where people use the truth predicate in natural language, but some of them might be confused, some of them might be paradoxical, some of them might be unsystematic, and we're allowed to improve upon that. Okay, whereas the scientist would ultimately try to describe the irrational behavior as it is, with more or less simplified descriptions. That's the difference. Now about the methodology. So there is again an overlap. If you read Carnap on explication, rational reconstruction, where he says, the explicatum, the result, must fulfill the requirements of a similarity with the explicandum, the starting point, exactness, fruitfulness, simplicity. And that reads a lot like the abductive methodology that people like Tim Williamson want to defend, for example, for logic. Okay, so there is fit of the evidence, but there's also virtues such as strength, simplicity, elegance, unifying power. Okay, so you can see the overlap. And Tim then speaks loosely of inference to the best explanation. Okay, and to some extent, I think that's right, and to other extent, I think that's wrong. Okay, so let me explain. So if you look at these criteria that Carnap gives, other than similarity, I've already dealt with that now on the previous slide. Things like exactness and fruitfulness and simplicity, that's mostly about pragmatic virtues. And you find these pragmatic virtues also at play when scientists choose their theories. Okay, and that's what Tim points to. Okay, so if that's what he has in mind, that's perfectly fine. Okay, you can say abduction is at work in both cases. But usually in science, inference to the best explanation goes beyond these merely pragmatic aspects of abduction. So I want to say there is pragmatic abduction and there is IBE, inference to the best explanation, that goes beyond that. And the point where it goes beyond that is that the point of inference to the best explanation is still that you want to explain a natural phenomenon out there. So ultimately, there needs to be the point in science where you get hold, where you get access to that phenomenon out there. Okay, and there, what you typically do is you collect data and you try to inductively confirm the hypothesis that you have abductively, as it were, derived by IBE. Okay, and I want to say it's this final bit that you don't find in rational reconstructions as I have them in my mind, okay? And it's the part that you also don't find in Tarski. So he starts with the intuitive verdicts, but then he defines his definition. It's not that he then derives empirical consequences and tests them or so, okay? The final bit of IBE is missing, okay? The pragmatic virtues are there, but not the final bit. And that's the difference to inference to the best explanation as you find it in science. Okay, so there's an overlap, but it's not the same thing either. About methods, right? Take, for example, mathematical methods. We all know how important they are in modern science. And if you look at Tarski's reconstruction of truth, then clearly logical and mathematical methods, higher order logic or set theory, played a crucial role. So again, you find the overlap. Generally, I want to say that rational reconstructions, they share methods with science, okay? And the sharing of methods is one of the reasons also why philosophy, in my sense, and science can interact successfully, and one and the same person has an easy time to do both, and that's good. I like that. Why not? Absolutely. Okay. And why can you use, for example, mathematical methods in philosophy, according to my conception? Because mathematics is not itself committed epistemically to particular ways that nature is like. Right? You can describe any kind of nature, as it were, with mathematical methods. And it can be used as a general kind of structure that is not tied to a particular natural universe of discourse either. Okay, so it fulfills this criterion. So you can use it in philosophy without invalidating my criterion. Okay, so that's why mathematical methods are perfectly available for the scientific philosopher in my sense. And in fact, there are numerous examples that show that they can be very useful, not necessarily, not always, but in many cases. Okay. Now, in fact, because of this overlap, there's another thing that can happen. So at times, actually, philosophy can even turn into science. Okay, and that has happened in the past. So, for example, when the ancient Greek were talking about atomism, this was not yet a scientific theory. It was a kind of way of conceiving of the world, a kind of conceptual framework. But then later, 19th and 20th century, atomism turned into a scientific theory. Okay, in chemistry, for example. Or we once analyzed mental concepts in philosophy, but then we had cognitive psychology. Or we had Tarski and Carnap on philosophical semantics, which turned into Montague, which was then a part of linguistic semantics, okay, part of empirical science. So that has happened all the time. And the reason is, I think, that philosophy has a kind of enabling function precisely due to its independence of empirical assumptions and domains, okay? And we should cherish that creative power. Now, the transition from philosophy to science takes place when it becomes possible to apply certain methods beyond those of rational reconstruction, okay? And then these methods are tied to specific domains or come with certain epistemic commitments to ways the world is like, okay? But when this happens, we do not think of the result as philosophy anymore, but as scientific, okay? Now you might ask, what about X-Phi? Because it is empirical. Here you could call it a part of science, but there's also reason to count it as philosophical. Think of my description of rational reconstruction, where you start with the X and want to end with an X prime. Part of the desiderata are that the X prime is sufficiently similar to the X. Okay. Now you could determine that sort of from the armchair, or you could empirical method to determine whether an X prime is still similar enough to the X, or what the X even is like that you start from. Okay. What are these initial verdicts? Okay. So if you think of X-Phi as doing that, then it's part of my rational reconstruction scheme, has a useful role there to play, but also a limited role. So X-Phi by itself, right, will not give you the X prime, okay? But it will only be useful to the extent to which you can use it to measure similarity of the X prime and the X on empirical grounds. That's it. All the other things you have to do yourself as a philosopher, okay? Empirical science in X-Phi won't solve the problem for you, okay? Now, final point, and I'm done, about progress. Both science and philosophy make progress, but the progress is different. And the reason is, again, science has a phenomenon out there that stabilizes the different theories that you might come up with, okay? So you get a kind of long-term convergence in science because there is the phenomenon out there that stabilizes theory choice, Okay. Now I want to say, according to my conception of scientific philosophy, you should expect progress, and you find progress. Things get clearer or more exact or more systematic, more consistent, and new possibilities are developed and so on. But remember, there is no stabilizing phenomenon out there, according to my conception. Okay, we're not in the business of describing the phenomenon out there anyway. Okay, so we lack the stabilizing phenomenon, and that's why you get progress in philosophy without convergence necessarily. Okay, rather you can make choices in philosophy freely, independently of what the world is like or the universe of discourse. The choice criteria might be weighted differently, and that's why it shouldn't come as a surprise that you don't get this convergence, yet you get progress. In the case of theories of truth, I once wrote a paper where I enumerated the desiderata for formal theories of truth. Okay, they're all pragmatic, more or less, okay, except for the similarity component, and you can weigh them differently, and that explains why you might get different formal theories of truth that improve the old ones. Okay, so like bridges, they can be improved, but you get a lot of non-convergence. Okay, you get all sorts of bridges, okay, which are useful more or less, if you look at this one here, for different purposes. You get improvement in philosophy, like improvements of Tarski's definition of truth that you find in the literature afterwards. Okay, so one gets better than the previous ones in some sense for certain purposes, but you don't get convergence. Okay, so some have replaced Tarski's explicit definition of truth by axioms. Deflationists like that. Okay, or you extend the domain of explication to a language with the truth predicate, right? Type freeness, Kripke. Okay. But what do you do then to avoid the paradoxes? Well, restrict the T-scheme or change the logic. And if you change the logic, you can change the logical constants, strong Kleene logic rather than classical one. Or you change the structural rules. That's what the young people do these days, okay? And so on and so forth. So this is open-ended, and it's very pluralistic because there is no stabilizing natural phenomenon that squeezes it to a long-term convergence. And yet, sort of vertically, we get better and better, okay? So let me conclude. I hope I've convinced you that rational constructionism, this proposal, might itself amount to a fruitful rational reconstruction of philosophy. Okay, philosophy differs ultimately in its aims from science, but both are helped by scientific methods, including mathematical ones, and both make progress. So there's an overlap. That is what philosophy, in my sense, makes philosophy scientific, but it's not science because it has different aims. Rational constructionism may also be viewed as reviving what was good about logical empiricism, that's the Carnapian background to my proposal, while leaving behind what was bad about it. So for example, I'm not in the business of rejecting metaphysics or the like, okay? And in the future, I think there will be new topics, like why don't we rationally reconstruct outputs, programs, and methods of artificial intelligence and machine learning? Okay, I think that in the future might be a big topic in the philosophy of AI or philosophy of machine learning. It will be rational reconstruction again. And the idea will be to make AI and machine learning more transparent, more understandable, more systematic, more easily criticizable, more coherent, more morally acceptable, and the like. And I hope you see that might be an important point for the future. Okay. And again, if there is this role that philosophy might take vis-a-vis AI and machine learning in the future, it will be about rational reconstructions. And again, mathematics will be crucial because otherwise you won't be able to do that. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for